last session, which is going to last to be short, I ask Hamouda Chekir, who's one of our founding members, and Jose Antonio Gonzales Anaya, to talk to us a little bit about some ideas on how to support a group of former ministers on international financial reform and the role of FLD. And so, Hamouda, welcome. And so I'll leave you the floor now for the last 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Martin, and I'm glad. First of all, very happy that we had this launching event for an initiative that we have been preparing for months now, and I'm even happier to host and present today Jose Antonio Gonzales Anaya, who's an economist by training, former Minister of Finance of Mexico, former CEO of Pemex, and former head of the Social Security system in Mexico, who's also been very much involved on international financial related issues. And the reason why we're having the conversation today with Jose Antonio is that he has been leading an initiative recently that inspired us within the FDL. And this initiative is a group of former ministers of finance that he created, and that got together to reflect on as ministers of finance and given their background and the lessons learned from their position on how collectively they could shape the health and health policy and public and health policy and healthcare and public healthcare system. And in discussing with Jose Antonio, we have reflected on the idea of creating the same format, that is to say, a ministerial council that will spearhead our effort within the FDL, that will provide us with some with the support and the wisdom of a group of ministers of finance and governors who would challenge our initiatives, help us in better crafting the policies that we would recommend, and also help us in the advocacy and outreach efforts. So let me now turn to Jose Antonio and probably ask him as a first question how he thinks that his initiative in a different field, which is that of the health and healthcare, has of getting together ministers of finance, has been effective to the policy debates.
Great. Thank you, Hamouda. Thanks for the invitation and congratulations on this panel, on this conference that I just heard. And it's an honor to be here in this panel and talk about this. I mean, what we started, this group of ex-ministers of finance, we're all friends from all over the world, literally from Latin America, from Africa, and from Asia. We started talking about, how the COVID pandemic was affecting health and economics. And I think what very quickly came out is that there is an urgent need to improve the dialogue between ministers of finance and ministers of health. Typically, the discussions between ministers of finance and ministers of health are restricted to two things: public healthcare and public finances. And, this is going to sound tricky or to some esoteric, but it's absolutely true. Health is not healthcare. And certainly health is not only public healthcare. And economic progress is not only about public finances. So we very quickly realized, some of us have been involved on both sides of the equation, that we needed to broaden the discussion on this. And we came up with a series of recommendations on what things should be talked about, how the discussion should be broadened, etc. And I don't want to take too much time on that, but there were things like, you need to get the private sector participating on this. And the ministers of finance have very long tentacles in regulation. if you don't regulate insurance properly, chances are you're not going to have the private sector providing health or healthcare. Secondly, in some cases, the health community likes to build hospitals and run hospitals. And in many cases, it's better to spend money on water and sanitation or on women's education. It pays a lot more to do that. Sometimes it pays more to put taxes on, sugary drinks, on sodas, and that does that. So we have pulled all of these things together, and I think it's made an important contribution.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. So let me now turn to the second questions, which is which is closer to our topic today. How do you see such a group shaping our own agenda, which is the one of development finance, of international finance, or helping countries on their financial issues?
Well, I'm going to make a bit of a caricature of the state of affairs because it's not true, but I think it helps to exemplify a view to try to highlight the role for a group of ex-ministers of finance to talk about. Typically in this debt development, debt finance issues, and as I heard in the previous panel, all of the discussions around debt restructuring that are inevitably going to come for all of the reasons that have been discussed. You have kind of three groups that there is the discussion in academic circles about research that's being done. And at one point in my life, I was an academic, and I firmly believe all of these things are very important, but the academic contributions are fundamental, to be sure you have the principles right of what it is you're doing. And some of these things were discussed in the previous panel. So that's one area. That's not where ministers of finance are going to contribute. The second area is whatever you do in terms of debt restructurings, financial architecture, etc., has to follow the academic principles, but they also have to comply with the financial architecture of the world, the international financial institution, and by that I mean the international financial institutions, their architecture. It has to fit into the way they work, or find ways to try to change it, to change that. It's okay to change the financial institution, and it has to work with the markets. And that also, you can also change it. And some of these ideas came out, swaps, etc. I'll make a small parenthesis in that. Commodity issues were mentioned. And my own personal experience in Mexico has been hedging its oil production for 30 years. And oil producing countries today are not hedging the price of oil in the future. And I know it's debatable, but I can guarantee you the price of oil is going to fall below 100. It has always happened. And now with all the initiatives on environmental and sustainable growth, it's almost inevitable that will happen. And to me, it's surprising that policymakers don't want to take that step. But then that's one area, one practical area where ex-ministers of finance can bring in interesting experiences of what they have done. This was one example. And the final point that I want to make is, academic discussions and discussions in Wall Street and in Washington are one thing. But if you want to do a debt restructuring, it has to fly politically. And if you can't construct a political story that it's digestible for, as a minister of finance, for your president, for your cabinet, for Congress, and for the people in general, it's not going to work. No matter how perfect you follow the academic principles, no matter how well the financial architecture is, this financial structure is for markets, if you can't, package it in a political story, and it's not going to fly. And I think ministers of finance also have a unique competitive advantage to contribute to this debate. And I'll mention one very, very silly example that both Hamouda and I were involved in with one country. We were discussing the debt restructure of Ecuador. And, in Spanish, we say we have one eye on one thing and another eye on another. We were always trying to get the political story in. The Minister of Finance was very politically oriented, so he was very keen on that. But one silly example, and it's absolutely silly, but it made a huge impact. Ecuador had it issued bonds, that were, 13 or 14% coupons. And while we were restructuring, we didn't plan this. We noticed that we could put a ceiling on the coupons. Now, all of you know that what's important in a restructure is the net present value. But politically, we said, look, we're not going to have bonds that are more than 6.9. Why 6.9? Because 7 was too much and 6.8 was too little. But this allowed the president to say two very simple stories. We are doubling the maturity of the debt of Ecuador. Instead of being 10 years, it's going to become 20 years. And we are lowering the interest to half, from 13, the maximum interest from 13 to 6.9. It was a very simple explanation. It was silly, but it made a huge political story. I'll stop there. Those are, I think, the kinds of things that are very practical, almost, as I said, silly, but they make a big difference.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. Let me ask you one final question. We are at a tipping point. Inflation in Europe, in the US, is at its highest in the last 40 years. We're seeing huge, moves from central banks. At least huge initial moves from central banks, and which are likely to continue. And how do you see the impact on emerging and developing countries from your experience, notably in Mexico in the 90s and before?
Well, again, Hamouda knows I speak with cliches, but the last time the Fed raised rates 75 basis points, except for this time, was November 20th, 1994. And I remember that clearly because the Mexican crisis erupted 3 weeks later. And that hike caused the cabinet crisis 5 days before a presidential transition, and everything unraveled. So the power of the Fed in emerging markets is huge. And I think many times we underestimate it. Two things happen. Even if you just mirror well, let me start at the beginning. First, the cost of financing goes up, 1 for 1. If the rates go up in the Fed by 100 basis points, your financing costs go up by 100 basis points. But it's even worse than that, because the spreads between the center, let's call it, the base markets, the dollar markets, and the emerging markets widen. An empirical regularity that I'm sure would fail at an academic circle is in peace times, the spread between between Mexico and the US in peace times is between around 350 basis points in the last 20 years. When the Fed starts hiking rates, that spread goes to over 600 basis points. And this, I looked at this in the last 20 years. And in the last 20 years, the Fed hasn't hiked rates much. Today, the spread is about 700 basis points between the central bank rate in Mexico and the Fed. So, you are amplifying the effects of financing, not just only foreign financing, but domestic financing. So that makes life very, very difficult. And Mexico is an investment grade country. This is only exacerbated in a non-investment grade country in emerging markets. So life gets very difficult when the Fed starts, putting on the brakes. And it's been at least, 20 years since we've had high rates. And we all thought that it was normal to have interest rates that were close to zero, and that's not the normal. So I think there are lots of people that are going to have to relearn how these things work.
Absolutely. And this is Mexico. So if we talk about low-income countries, the effect is going to be even further exacerbated. And that's why we're extremely glad and honored to have you and a group of ministers that we will announce in the weeks and in the weeks to come, that will help us think about these issues and all the implication of the changing global environments. Thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for taking the time. It has been a pleasure, and we are glad and honored to have you and to launch with you this initiative on the Ministerial Committee.
Thank you for the invitation. The honor is mine.
Thank you, Pepe Tonio. Thank you all. Let me just say a few last words. It's been an exciting afternoon. Really happy to have all these participants around the table to launch this initiative. As Jose Antonio just said, you know, peacetime, war times, and we are in war times in many dimensions. And there are so many tensions ahead: the tightening of monetary policy, the volatility of commodity prices, maybe a major financial crisis, and on top of that, urgent needs to tackle climate change. So we need to put all our energies together to connect our ideas and to make sure that they are conveyed to the highest levels. The previous panel on China was fascinating, on the willingness of our friends in China or outside China to channel ideas to the highest authorities. We also saw with this discussion on liquidity how much a simple situation can degenerate into a major financial crisis if you don't have the proper backstops. It's a lot of things that we need to do. We need to find the proper ideas. We need to make sure that they are properly advertised. We need to make sure that they are implemented in one way or the other. It is not just another academic experiment of Pepetonio that we want to launch, but as you just said, we want to make it practical, and all the vehicles that you can bring, will be most welcome to make sure that they are appropriately framed and can be useful for the debate. Our goal is to give a voice to all the think tanks that work with us, an additional voice, if possible, to the global south, to come up with ideas implementable and fast enough in the way they are operated, that we don't, always fall behind the curve of the needs which are becoming even more pressing every day. So I want to end up with a positive tone. It's great to have you all. I'm sure we can move forward together with new ideas, and yes, so we look forward to get you all for the next round of discussion. You can come, forward us ideas, and we'd be happy to follow up. So thanks to all of you for participating, and see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.